Einen wunderschönen guten Morgen wünsche ich Ihnen. Herzlich willkommen zu unserem Tag der Datenökosysteme. Ich bin Alexander Nuak, ich leite die Geschäftsstelle des Fraunhofer-Verbunds IUK-Technologie und ich habe das große Vergnügen, Sie heute durch den Vormittag führen zu dürfen. Gemeinsam mit der Industrial Data Spaces Association haben wir diese Konferenz gemeinsam organisiert, um Ihnen zu zeigen, wie weit die Entwicklungen im Bereich der gesicherten Daten
of the secure data spaces in compliance with the required data sovereignty. But before starting properly, I would like to provide some housekeeping information to you. And this is also quite new. I mean, this is a purely virtual or online conference. And as you may have noticed initially, we are providing 2 live streams for 2 separate languages. There will be one live stream in German, the other one in English, and the English one is based on the support of our simultaneous interpreters. And of course, we would be very pleased if you made active contributions.
Zum einen die Möglichkeit, mit den Teilnehmern in der Veranstaltung zu chatten. Sie finden diesen Chatbereich, wenn Sie den Vollbildmodus des Videos wieder klein machen, entweder an der rechten Seite oder, wenn Sie mit einem Tablet arbeiten, im unteren Bereich. Dort können Sie also mit allen Teilnehmern chatten. Und zum
the participants, and furthermore, in the Q&A tab, questions and answers, you may ask questions. That is, in this area, you will ask questions which our experts will be happy to answer after the items of the agenda, data spaces in action and Broaden the Horizon. But you do not have to answer these questions yourself. If you appreciate questions asked before, you can mark these, thereby making sure that this question will be at the very top of the ranking. And questions which are at the top may then be answered even within the framework of this conference. But even if our experts cannot answer all your questions during the conference, these questions will not be lost, quite the opposite. We will be collecting all the questions that will be answered subsequently and made available on this platform so that you can read the answers at your own leisure. But now let us start with a very interesting and fruitful conference. We have invited representatives of ministries, industrial associations, and the 2 organizers to a joint talk. And we have recorded this talk before the conference proper, and we are going to show it to you now. A cordial welcome to you. I would like to welcome you to the welcome talk of this day of the data ecosystems. I'm very pleased to introduce our guests. And on the one hand, we are welcoming Professor Inga Schieferdecker, who is the head of section at the Ministry for Research and Education, and she's in charge of research for technological sovereignty and innovation. Furthermore, Mr. Stefan Schnau, who is the head of section in the German Ministry for the Economy and Energy, in charge of the Department of Digital and Innovative Policy. Furthermore, we are welcoming Mr. Bernhard Müller, the Managing Director of the SIG company, and he's a member of the board of the International Data Spaces Association. And as a host, so to speak, we welcome Professor Raimund Neugebauer, the president of the Fraunhofer Society. And I would like to ask him my first question, Mr. Neugebauer. Data is gaining importance, in particular as far as companies are concerned. And often the companies are being faced with the question of what or how to handle their data. How can they get the best benefit from the data? And what do you answer to this? Dear Mr. Noack, before answering this question, it is an urgent need for me to welcome also Professor Schieferdecker, Mr. Schnau, and Mr. Müller as the other participants of the talk, and I would like to thank them very much for being available to this format. And now, as to your question, Mr. Noack, I would like to use the example of a very topical subject to briefly illustrate this. That is the COVID-19 vaccines, which have actually encouraged us a lot recently, and we have learned that one of the two active ingredients must be cooled, that is at minus 70 degrees centigrade. That is the required temperature. And the question arises that if we want to vaccinate millions of people, how can we guarantee the cold chain, and how do manufacturers and suppliers, the doctors or the health authorities know what the condition of the cold chain were, whether there were any deviations? And here data systems will allow us in future to monitor this without any gaps, and we can also inform all the players involved so that no serious mistakes are made. And this example is very impressive because it concerns the industry, medicine, politics, public administration, all of these players at once. The data spaces which we need to this end are already available, but we also know that currently they are subject to the control of industrial companies beyond our influence. And for this reason, for a couple of years now, we at the Fraunhofer Society launched the initiative for the international data space. And I would like to again thank the two representatives of the German ministries, that is research and the economy, and both ministries have provided a great deal of support. And without their support, not only the financial, but also the technical support, we wouldn't have been able to make that much progress with this project. And I would also like to thank Mr. Müller for the active contributions of the industry. Nowadays, industrial data spaces is integrated in the GAIA-X project. And Mr. Schnorr, I would like to thank you in particular for the fact that the German Ministry for the Economy has been a door opener so that we can carry out this project together. And with GAIA-X, we will certainly succeed, I believe. And if you will, this is a historical point in time for opportunities of the economy, that in future those who supply data will also be able to profit from the data. And Mrs. Schieferdecker, thank you. As Mr. Neugebauer has said, at that time, the launched this development then at the time of the industrial data space. And what are the interests of the German ministry? That is, why are you getting involved in this development of data ecosystems? Mr. Nuack, Mr. Neugebauer, Mr. Schnorr, Mr. Müller, thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be participating here. And as we know, for centuries, data has been the source of information. And business models have always been based on data or safety-relevant issues. In particular, in the digital age, digitized data has become an important resource for innovation and novel business models. And for this reason, to us, it is a natural interest that with research and development, data-based innovation is being promoted. We want to support this development so that we are very pleased to become involved in the international data space. That is, it used to be the industrial data space, now it's the international data space initiative. And we hope that beyond this, with the interoperable connection to the aforementioned data spaces, also in the administration, but in particular in the fields of education and research, we can provide access to the industry to very important, essential data, and in doing so, to make possible new business models. And to this end, this data from the industry must be interlinked, must be interconnected, but also with the data from other data spaces. And this must be secured based on trust. And then we would aggregate this data and translate this data into added value in terms of product and services. And to this end, we time and again rely on research and development. Thank you. We are always hearing about the industry and value added, and the German Ministry for the Economy has also supported the European dimension with respect to GAIA-X. And what are the reasons of your ministry to become involved in this initiative, Mr. Schnorr? Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Guak, and for organizing this event on the Day of the Data Ecosystem. This is a very important subject, Professor Neugebauer. That's a very good idea, as always. Professor Schäferdecker, Mr. Müller. Indeed, it is true that the data is becoming essential for companies. And I would like to illustrate this with an example. The problem is that every company at present actually is managing its own data separately, if at all. So eventually we are faced with the situation that there are many very small data lakes or data ponds, but this data cannot be aggregated, cannot be merged. In order to merge this data, we also need the appropriate infrastructure, as in the case of roads, where I have to interlink the roads and streets. And for this reason, it is our purpose to establish such a data infrastructure and ecosystem where the many existing small data lakes and ponds can be merged to form a big ocean. And this big ocean must, of course, be secure and safe. The data which I put in there must also be sovereign there, which means that the companies must be able to decide who is allowed to use which data for what purpose, and we want to provide this infrastructure, and this is why we launched the system GAIA-X as a link between existing suppliers or providers, cloud providers, in order to provide the data infrastructure, and on this basis to also do something useful with this data, that is to launch the relevant services. And this is why we said GAIA-X is a very good solution. We need this, and we are supporting this. 1 year ago, GAIA-X was presented. After 1 year now, the ISST, that is the establishing company, has been founded in Belgium. 22 companies were involved. Now we have more than 140 member companies and even more than 350 companies which are in the process of developing standards and similar things. That is, they are developing the architecture for this data infrastructure so that this data will be interoperable and so that the companies will have a basis on which they can store the data and also use the data to develop relevant business models. This is precisely what we are doing, and this is also the mission of GAIA-X, and this is an industry-driven system that's very important to us. Mr. Miller, the International Data Spaces Association is doing its utmost to also convince and involve stakeholders and operators, that is, those who would profit from data ecosystems. And what are the duties and the interests of the IDSA in this field? Yes, well, I would also like to welcome all of you cordially. I'm very pleased to be participating in this, to represent the International Data Space Association. At the same time, I'm also representing the industry. That is, we are a company which was one of the founding members of the association. It still is about 4 years ago. We began together with the Fraunhofer Society to launch this subject because we as a sensor company are one of the sources of data. And this data, of course, is very difficult to handle. If it's on its own hard disk, that is, then it can hardly be used by others. And when we assume that data is the gold of the future, this data must also be usable for others. That is, the applications which can be developed on the basis of the data will come about only if we have a network where the data can be transmitted safely and securely, and if the property is also protected. I mean, data is a value as such, an intrinsic value, and in this context, it should also be protected. And Mr. Neugebauer's example shows that data is very important for cross-industries, and they're making possible new functions. And 4 years ago, this was our purpose when we became a member of the association, and we also wanted to convince as many other partners as possible to participate. It's to little avail when only 3 or 4 companies do this, but we really need a large community of members which will then be able to extract the value value from the data to make new applications possible. And with respect to new developments, we are seeing that these are coming not from a single company, but rather from an entire community. And this was the reason for us, the company and the IDSA, the reason to promote this. And in the meantime, the parts which have been developed are the foundations for the GAIA-X, which is lifting this to a new level. To make all this usable at the international level, although here we are also talking about specific GAIA-X domains which have been defined, whereas before we actually looked at the entire communication where we wanted to interconnect, to interlink the many small data lakes and ponds to develop new solutions. All of you have mentioned this. Data sovereignty is very important. Let us elaborate on this. The question for you, Mr. Schnorr, what is actually the significance of data nowadays for companies? In this context, what is the role of data sovereignty, in particular with respect to exploiting the huge potential of data? Well, I do believe that nowadays, as we all know, almost all product that is physical objects are connected to the internet, and all these objects produce data. A lot of money is being made with services, that is the offers on the basis of data, that is data which I can generate. This applies to business sectors, but it also applies to the field of business to consumer and consumer to business. That is what objects can be generated with the data. And what is more is artificial intelligence, which means by means of AI, the data can be interconnected in such a way that perfectly new ideas and business models or services can be created. In the field of the manufacturing industries alone, we are expecting, according to a study which we commissioned for the next 5 years, an increase in value added of 32 billion euros, and this is based only on artificial intelligence and data-based. So data is really an asset for the company, so that in addition to the conventional products, to offer products and services. And realizing this value of the data is one thing. This is what we are doing with respect to raising the awareness, that is exploiting the data. And then we must also talk about what data is available and what companies may do with this data. And to this end, we need the aforementioned infrastructure. And then you need to know which data can be shared with whom and where. And the user or consumer, of course, wants data to be secure and trustworthy. And this is why we need this sound infrastructure, but at the final analysis, the money will be made with the services, and the basis of the services is the data. We know this with all the apps which we have in our smartphones. We know what the options are when we interlink, interconnect, aggregate a large variety of data, and this is why we are placing such a focus on making companies fit for understanding data, for using data in order to generate additional value and thereby prosperity for all. Mr. Miller, what is your purpose with respect to data sovereignty? How would you like to translate it into practice? As the speaker before me said, it's important that we can generate new applications and that this data is used to create new things, and these have an intrinsic value. And of this I believe, well, the policymakers must also do something. That is, they must provide the intellectual property rights, because value is created. Generating data is not something which happens as such, but it's based on values. And these property rights are similar to the patent protection which we know nowadays. And for the data which you generate, which you make available, which you may already have analyzed, well, for this you want to see a certain economic financial profit. And this is also the point of the international data space, that is, the data sovereignty, must be guaranteed within this system. And it would be a vision of the future to me when we say that we pay not only for physical products, but also data, which is already often the case. But then the industry itself, I mean, the industrial production data, in the industry, this is still something new. And logistics is very important in this context. And many companies do not exchange data because they are saying, well, it's important value to me to know what happened in my company, and I must get this value. I must be paid if I make available data. And this is what I mean by data sovereignty. So a lot remains to be done. We have made a major technological step forward with respect to the international data space, where we have defined functionalities, connectors, and all this infrastructure. But what is still missing is the general framework conditions which are needed to this end. And Mr. Neugebauer, what is the significance for Fraunhofer of data, and what is the role of data sovereignty in particular as far as the economic potential of data is concerned?
Well, I believe the two preceding speakers have already explained this very well. I would just like to add that, I mean, you're talking about two fields here. On the one hand, data sovereignty in general, and then the importance for businesses. Now, on data sovereignty, I think we all agree. It is an essential prerequisite for technological sovereignty, thinking about the economy and businesses. And both together is a very important prerequisite for political sovereignty at the end of the day. We've seen that based on the Corona warning app. I mean, our hands were bound. We couldn't do a lot until the final day. I mean, the Bluetooth interfaces were all held by Google and Apple. So we couldn't do very much about it. And the second importance is for businesses. In a current study by the ISST, we've gained the finding that about 84 to 85% of all businesses across all industries in Germany just collect data, but they do not use this data in a profitable way for an added value. I mean, this primarily concerns the small and medium-sized enterprises that make a very important contribution to the German economy, but also other industries, mechanical engineering, chemical companies, automotive suppliers, and others, who really give away added value that they don't use. But Mr. Schnorr has already explained this, because in future, somebody who supplies data, stores data in very large volumes, production data, for example, product data, business model data. At the end of the day, this data supplier will become somebody who uses this data to create future business models. And I think this is the big importance for businesses in Germany. Globally speaking, in material added value, we're one of the strong nations. If we don't want to lose control here of the data, we must use the data for creating added value. We must really put on some muscle here and must become quicker. A strong European data economy can also be a very powerful engine for innovation. Ms. Schieferdecker, is the development of secure data spaces a good engine to also differentiate yourselves against other European developments? Could you say that the future data strategy of the federal government also makes a contribution there? Yes, I'm quite happy to comment on this. The other speakers have also said how important data is for the general economy. This can only be further developed by securing data sovereignty. as was already explained. So the data strategy will include the manifestation on further development of our data infrastructure, but also the further development of regulations on the safe and secure use of data, also informational use of data, together with the use of data in the interest of the common and the public good, also using of data, evaluating data, and also about the further development of technologies, because not all of the fields about managing data, use of infrastructure, or use of data has been regulated so far. So, for example, the Federal Ministry of Research, and the data strategy is something which is a cross-departmental activity. We have defined 70 measures. In addition to GAIA-X for industry data, we also want to develop research data in our national research data infrastructure, or also a digital education and training initiative. So that together with research and development activities, we also want to develop data spaces in health, mobility, or energy. And in addition to that, at the European level, there are many initiatives that are all subsumed in Horizon Europe, so that it's not only industry data, but also research data and other data that could be used for the whole of Europe, so that our national data strategy makes a contribution to the vision of having data-driven innovation and improved transfer of technologies and know-how, and also businesses like this. Ms. Schieferdecker, gentlemen, thank you very much for your contributions. Now, before we conclude, I would like to put a question to our two organizers of this Data Ecosystems Day. Let me start by asking Mr. Müller. Mr. Müller, could you summarize the IDSA's contribution to businesses who can fully use the value of their data? Well, first of all, I think that the value of the IDSA is to bring many businesses together, to think about this, first of all. This is a basic prerequisite of using data. You must first know what you want to use it for. And this group of businesses, I think it's over 120 businesses in the IDSA currently. They will think about new applications. That is a new added value based on data. They give initiatives, make incentives. And the group is very interested. And this new group helps us to integrate new functions into this software. Because if you really want to use these applications, you can always improve software. Software is never a final product. It's always a kind of living product that is constantly improved and further developed. And this is why this group of businesses, of companies, is very important and very helpful. Furthermore, I believe it's also about speed. We in Europe must deal with this topic. It is not about one following the other, but you ideally have to deal with this in parallel at the same time in many, many businesses, so that you create a certain momentum. And this is where the IDSA, this association, is something which promotes this, gives ideas, motivates people to participate, so we can gain a certain momentum and speed. This was founded a couple of years ago. Now GAIA-X has been added, which is very beneficial. But we must agree so that our competitors in the global markets are not quicker than us. We are all aware of the topic, and the IDSA means that many, many players in parallel try to do something about it at the same time. Mr. Neugebauer, the question to you also. What's the contribution of Fraunhofer to businesses being better able to use their data? Well, I hope that we can make a visible contribution. I can think of 4 points. First, we are making a great effort and we actively pursue the development of a joint understanding for data content in all the stakeholders. This is the prerequisite of really speaking with one voice and going in the same direction. The second point is that we promote the paradigm change in many, many different levels. And we thirdly do this in a kind of enabling role by setting the framework conditions and offering a data infrastructure via our institutes. This infrastructure makes it possible to not only have island solutions, but a complex framework for small and medium-sized businesses and other industries. And then last but not least, we show what new business models become possible for businesses. Within such a data space, you have new models of creating value, added value by certification, by brokers, mediators who act in this data space and follow up on new business models. And at the end of the day, create new added value. Ms. Schieferdecker, Mr. Shaw, Mr. Müller, Mr. Neugebauer, thank you so much for your contributions. I think it was a great welcome talk, a wonderful kickoff for a very exciting day of data ecosystems. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you. You have maybe noticed that Ms. Plöger had also been announced as a participant of the welcome talk. Now, for technical reasons, she wasn't able to make the contribution as a representative of the Federal Association of German Industries. But we have recorded a video with her, and we'll show it to you now. Ms. Iris Plöger, let me welcome you, member of the Executive Board of the Federal Association of German Industry. Ms. Plöger, we have just heard the views of the ministries here in the welcome talk, but something that we're also very interested in is hearing what the motivation of the German industry is to invest in data rooms and data ecosystems. Mr. Nuak, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be able to make a brief input for your conference. Of course, it's a central topic for industry in this transformation phase to create, open, and use data spaces in the best possible way. I mean, it has become a truism that only if data spaces are accessible for many, AI and data assets can be used there. Now, in the past, I think we've had a few discussions that were superfluous on access rules to data spaces. We're continuing with these discussions, and we must always decide on a case-by-case basis. But it's more, I think, a question of skills. We see that many businesses haven't gained sufficient experience in managing data. It starts on a small scale. In a company, we have individual departments collecting data, gathering data. We talk about data puddles sometimes. But already when it comes to cross-departmental sharing and use of data, it becomes more difficult. I mean, small and medium-sized companies have a difficult time sometimes, more difficult time than the larger companies. But it's not only about use of data in one single company, but it's about cross-sector and cross-industry use of data. And this is where we need a lot of skills, but also trust and confidence. We need players who can place their trust in a reliable data infrastructure, which complies with all requirements for security, for data protection, and companies want to have data sovereignty, sovereignty of the data that they supply into the system. This is why we support GAIA-X as the European project very much, which could create this confidence-based data space with a good governance structure. Something that we sometimes see as an obstacle in Europe, which is high security requirements for data, not only personal data, but also process and product data, could be turned into a virtue. And we could say this is a standard that could be used globally. And we invite everybody else to participate in the standard, but it must be held up very high and must comply with our European requirements. These secure data spaces, do they have the potential to differentiate ourselves from something that is happening outside of Europe? Do we have a potential to become an innovation driver? Well, I think you shouldn't be under any illusions here. With the European GDPR, we've always said that we're creating a gold standard that everybody else will follow. We've always stressed that the freedom of other regions in the world who don't have this European regulation can also be used in research and other activities. But we certainly want to develop our own way, our own approach. We see that international competition is becoming fiercer and fiercer. People are talking about decoupling relative openly now, and the German industry, which is very globalized, is suffering from that. We can see that China creates data spaces without any problems in such a large country where scalability is very easy. We see very agile platforms in the US, which can be used in the US market, but also in other parts of the world with a high degree of scalability. We think that our challenge is that we're strong in our industry. We have more specific applications, and scalability isn't so easy as isn't as easy as in the B2C field. But we must use our core competence of German engineering in order to develop tailor-made solutions. In the past few years, we've seen that the big players, also from the US, haven't had an easy time to enter into the B2B processes so quickly. They need a lot of know-how, which we have in Europe and in Europe. In Germany, we still have an industry rate of 23% in the GDP, which is very high. And this is exactly the core competence that we must develop into the data spaces and use as our innovation driver. Ms. Blöger, thank you very much for the statement. Well, and we'll see during this day, also the conference, what potential we can actually use. Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you, and I wish you a very successful and pleasant day. Thank you. Now, we know the motivation of the ministries and industry, and also the strategic motivation of the organizers of the conference. But now let's give the word and the floor to the developers. And one of the most important industry providers is giving the first presentation.
Professor Otto, I'm very pleased to welcome you this morning. And now I would like to ask you to provide an introduction into the subject of data spaces and the related business applications, and the floor is yours. Thank you, Mr. Nurk, for this very kind introduction. And before we start properly, I would like to use this opportunity to welcome all the participants to this virtual conference. These are interesting times, not only as far as the pandemic is concerned, but also as far as the development of the data infrastructure at the national and European levels are concerned. So this is something which I believe is really a great opportunity. And I would propose that we start with a brief presentation which I've prepared, and I would like to start with the subject which was mentioned in the prior expert talk. That is the point of the data ecosystems and the role of the data spaces in there. Perhaps we should move on to the next chart to see in which areas such data ecosystems are being or might be developed. And this is a list of examples which was also put forward at the GAIA-X conference last week, and we can see that the alliance of companies based on the wish of a common customer innovation can be found in almost all areas. And Mr. Neugebauer mentioned a very good example from healthcare with respect to the cold chains. That is a requirement for the distribution of the vaccine within the framework of the COVID-19 pandemic. And such examples illustrate very well that we have a big challenge here, and it illustrates that we cannot solve this challenge on a go-it-alone basis, because a single company may not have all the levers, the tools which it needs to succeed. And for this reason, this term of ecosystem is very important, because it is a multilateral format of organizing around a joint innovation, and it's very important. And this also makes the term different from other notions such as value chains and so forth, that each and everybody must really profit from this. That is, the company's own business models must work, but in this respect, the ecosystem as a whole must also be competitive. This is of European significance, and let's now move on to the next chart, because not only the German data strategy refers to sharing data, data sovereignty and data spaces, but also the European data strategy, which was launched early this year and which Mrs. von der Leyen also referred to in her speech on the State of the Union. And we said what we need is these data spaces, and I found that this was a very nice metaphor of the prior speakers. That is, the different data ponds or puddles should be linked, and to this end we need the data spaces. And she illustrated this because she referred to 9 separate specific data spaces, and she said to this end we see GAIA-X as the essential infrastructure, which as an architecture of standards takes up things which we have already made, things we have already invested in, things which are already working, and among these the IDS development. But of course the question now arises, and I think that all of us can feel this: if this is such a specific requirement in a data strategy of the European Union, that we want to establish 9 data spaces, then the question is, what actually is such a data space, and what do I have to do to create it? And this brings me to the next chart. Here you can see a representation of the fundamental design principles of data spaces, and you will want to know that data space is a concept for data integration. And this is first based on the fact that there is no physical data integration, but eventually the data remains where it is generated, and it is exchanged only if this is necessary. And this corresponds to the approach of the interlinkage of the individual data ponds without putting the data in a big data ocean. And on the other hand, there is the principle of the integration on the semantic level, and this is quite important. we do not impose a database pattern on the different data. This would be impossible, and because then one community would have to agree on such a format, a database format, and they would also have to do this in all applications, but this wouldn't make sense. What we want is a decentralized approach. Why? Well, because the world as such is decentralized. We can see that intelligence, that is the computing power, is becoming wider, broader. Just look at the Internet of Things and smartphones, and for this reason, the local resources, data processing resources, should also be used there where they are. Another point is that in the final analysis, we also provide for redundancies because companies represent real life, real world objects with the data. So we have an intended redundancy here. And it's also important that such data spaces can overlap one another and can be interlinked. And we heard this from Mr. Müller. Because a characteristic feature of current development is that companies cooperate across different sectors. So they can be members of several data spaces. And these basic 4 principles were defined 4 years ago on the basis of the IDS initiative. That is the IDS initiative, because I, as the one who supplies the data, also want to remain in charge of the data, and I also want to ensure trust between the participants, the players. Now let's have a look at an example where we demonstrate how data spaces are related to data ecosystems. And here we have the typical architectural models. At the top we have the ecosystems where new business models and services are being developed, but these are based on a data space which, if need, will interconnect these data puddles. I like this term more and more. And to this end, I need the software infrastructure illustrated in orange at the bottom. And that is what we also are promoting in the data space of mobility. Now, let's have a look at the next chart to understand what it is. What do we have to do to really launch a data space? And here we can see that this work is not restricted to technical matters, and I will start at the bottom. Of course, we need a distributed data infrastructure, a federated infrastructure, as has already been mentioned, such as by Mr. Schnoor. But we also need a shared vocabulary. My standard example is always mobility. That is, the electric charging station must be defined together. That is, we as a car maker, as a rental car company, as municipalities, as energy utilities. So we must agree on the features, on the characteristics of a charging column. And we must also have a joint understanding of these features. Then we need a different type of governance, which means that we can no longer impose some orders, such as, well, you must use this format and I will put it in your job specification because you're part of my company. No, we need different incentives. What is also important is who will operate such a data space. Will it be a single company, a group of companies, a cooperative similar to the German Raiffeisenbanks? And we must also ask how we are going to pay for such a data space. And recently I heard a nice metaphor for this. That is, the first pizza will not pay for the oven. So we must also provide an oven before we can make our own pizza. And this is a typical phenomenon of infrastructures. And we must also have incentive systems. This is typical of multilateral markets. Those who have the data must be encouraged to share the data. We need low entrance barriers, and we also need an easy use of those who will translate the data into new business models. And with this, I would like to close my brief keynote address. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Otto, for this very inspiring keynote speech. What we have heard is whetting our appetite to learn what applications have already been given thought to, which technologies are already available, and we will elaborate in this in the following session, Data Spaces in Action. And if you, ladies and gentlemen, would like to ask any questions of our experts, then you can click on the tab Q&A. You can write down your questions there. Some among you have already done so. And now we will go on with the data spaces in action. Yes, Mr. Otto, so we are going on with you right away. I can only invite you to show us how the data spaces in action will look like. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Noack. This is probably the best approach. That this is probably the thing that is most interesting to you, that is where you can see how all these things come about. And the other day, I heard a nice term that is the proof of the pudding. I mean, that is what we say. And I'm very pleased that in this sequence, Data Spaces in Action 5, there is this cool presentation which will show that this is not something which we're only hoping for, but it is something which is already in existence, which can already be used. And we've heard that in many industries, data spaces are being created, are being needed, and now we would start with one industry which is of eminent importance for the German economy, that is the automotive industry, and in particular the logistic supply there. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Ukriel, who will elaborate on this. Sebastian, please. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Otto. Today, I will talk about our project in cooperation between ThyssenKrupp and VW. And the point of this is that we want to create transparency in the supply chain. And now the first chart, please. Yeah, the next one, please. Here we can see that these supply chains are highly complex nowadays. In the automotive supply chain, there are up to 40,000 companies which make sure that eventually cars will be built. And if you have 40,000 companies, you also want to coordinate this in one way or another. And we find that we need transparency to optimize these processes so that at the end of the day, the cars will be produced. And the standard processes are working extremely well. But sometimes there is also some force majeure or an act of God, and as we are seeing in this year. And we also need information in the case of bottlenecks. If there is a system, for instance, which has been damaged by an act of God, we have to manage this bottleneck. And to this end, we need information. And this information, which we must exchange beyond the standard case, is actually quite critical. Companies are saying, I would not like to share this information. It's sensitive information. I don't know what's going to happen to this data. The data may be misused. These are typical examples of risks which companies are seeing, such as price dumping on the part of the supplier. The supply chain may be revealed. They might be in a weaker position with respect to price negotiations. And from the OEM point of view, there is the fear that the supplier may then or may not provide the required capacities if they know exactly what will be needed on the following day. And this actually boils down to a lack of trust that this information will not be exchanged. When we look at this, we are saying, okay, we now need trust. And while there are enough possibilities to build up trust between suppliers, but how can we do this at the technical level, that we build up the trust that the sensitive information may be shared? And that is what we want to accomplish with the IDS, because we want to set up some rules in order to create trust in the data recipient. And now let's have a look at the next chart. And here we can see the supply chain, which we are discussing. This is a plant of ThyssenKrupp in Hilsenburg and one in Salzgitter of BW, between which we exchange data on the basis of IDS. Now in the next chart we can see a screenshot of this prototype. And what can it do? First of all, it's integrated into the production planning systems. We are not talking about some such tables, but the system really works with the proper real-life production data. And here we are exchanging stock information, production information, demand information. And these are not mere forecasts, but we are exchanging the real-life information. And now there may be concern what will happen to the information. Features of the prototype are that the data is exchanged on a bilateral basis and we are able to respond to specific situations, and then we can establish data links, specific data links. And what is important for the propagation of such a software program is that we have to provide benefits to both parties. And if this prototype is to be integrated into the supply chain, not only horizontally, but also upstream, then we must create a win-win situation by using quid pro quo, that is a mutual benefit, in order to organize this information exchange on a bilateral basis. And two final comments about this. Certain rules, for instance, say that the information, the data will be deleted automatically, and the receiver of the data can't do anything against it. If this had been agreed upon after 24 hours, the data may be deleted. Or if I receive additional data, the old data may be deleted, for instance. And these are certain use control rules, as we call them, which are also implemented in the prototype, and this makes the data exchange possible. People now say, okay, we can provide the data, and the success of this prototype is so great that we're saying, well, it will be used at least until the middle of next year between these two sites. Yeah, this is all from me. Thanks a lot, Sebastian. This is very clear, and what I appreciate is the principle of quid pro quo or mutuality, because data sharing works not only in one direction. If I'm only the one who provides data and never get data, then I will not be happy. And what I also appreciate is the peer-to-peer pull principle. That is that you request data and your network. This is very illustrative. Thank you, Sebastian. And now I would like to move on to the next data space in action. And I said that the automotive industry is of great relevance to the German economy, but actually this also applies to Industry 4.0 as a whole. And for this reason, it's hardly surprising that the next presentation will be about Industry 4.0, and I'm very pleased to welcome Mr. Thomas Gussländer. And I think that you have your colleague with you, Mrs. Liliana Stojanovic. And now I would like to hand over to you, Thomas, and you will talk about Industry 4.0 within ecosystems, not only within a single plant. Your turn, please.
Thank you, Boris, for this kind introduction. Yes, normally Liliana would have joined me. Unfortunately, she became ill yesterday, so I'm on my own. Sorry about that. but we have prepared this presentation together. This is about industrial use cases. It's about the question to what extent we can use the technology of the IDS in production and can apply it in production. Now, from the German perspective, and more from the international perspective, the Industry 4.0 platform has become more and more important. What concepts are there, what technologies are there that we have to merge with what we require for data sovereignty? And we've selected two use cases: collaborative condition monitoring and smart factory web. On my next page, I wanted to summarize the industrial community for you. It's called IDSI, IDS Industrial, in other words. Now, it's currently two communities. On the left-hand side, we've got the community of Platform Industry 4.0. There's a reference architecture model Industry 4.0, has been around for a longer time, RAM-I 4.0. And there are specifications of this ADSET administration shell where the SPS Connect newer versions have just been published. You can work with that. There's a data model. There are interfaces. And there are solutions which apply the specification. The solution, however, of Industry 4.0 doesn't only address interoperability, but also questions for autonomy and data sovereignty, in addition to sustainability. One of the most important visions of 2030 of Platform Industry 4.0. We must now check as to how we can make the RAM-I 4.0 and the reference model for international data spaces. How can we bring them together? How can we make them compatible and make them cooperate so that we have interoperable solutions, not only on a syntactic level, but also at the semantic level? And this is the task of the industrial community. We want to list the challenges, want to mirror them against the requirements in order to identify any gaps, any missing points that will have to be completed in terms of a good infrastructure and architecture. Because the market, at the end of the day, and I'm convinced on that, will only accept a fully integrated solution. The next page shows the two use cases that we have been using for our study. On the left-hand side is the collaborative condition monitoring use case. This is one of the location-based and reference use cases which have also been studied in Industry 4.0. In particular, about the question, in data sharing and data exchange, how can I make sure that all the interests of component manufacturers, machine producers, and other players can be taken into account? And how can I solve these requirements in such a way that everybody, based on their data, can use services such as condition monitoring or remote maintenance or servicing, and also offer these services? The problem is that the component manufacturer normally doesn't only install their components into one single system or machine, but in different machines. They run in different industry environments. And it doesn't make any sense to offer individual cloud solutions for that, because the factory operator would have a whole gamut of different solutions with different firewalls and so on. Now, this is calling out for a solution which is fully integrated and uses an integrated data space, creating this data space with good control and management of usage rights, and also applying certain policies to do this. This is the one use case that we're looking into. The other one is the smart factory web use case. This is about thinking about, now, if I have a marketplace for industry production, maybe if you compare this with tourism or mobility, If I have an inquiry to produce something, and I would be able to do a kind of matchmaking in a marketplace so that contracts can be entered into upon demand, bids, quotations can be written instantly, that is instant quoting, as it is sometimes called. How does this impact the visibility of data, usage rights for data? Do I really want to give away this information of the capabilities I have, information that could be used by others? So the earmarking of data usage, if you like, or the purpose-bound character of data usage is something we would like to study. The Smart Factory Web is a test bed of the Industrial Internet Consortium and is organized by Fraunhofer-Gesellschaft. And the other use case is a GAIA-X use case and is developed and built by Fraunhofer-Gesellschaft, our colleagues in Lemgo. Okay, if I could come in, Thomas. It's a very exciting topic, but I think we must speed up a little. So I would like to ask you to conclude so that we can keep our time plan, if that's okay. If you could make a final statement, please, so that we can come to the next pitch presentation. Okay, right. Statement a little bit more about the next page. Okay. Now, in this industrial community, we're working on these use cases to the extent that we use templates which analyze use cases and then break them down gradually to the requirements of data usage control and data provenance tracking. This community is open, anybody can join, and we would like to bring this together, Industry 4.0, IDS, and GAIA-X. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Thomas. It's very exciting, and in particular because from the viewpoint of a company which uses all of this, you've all put this together. So the administration, Shell, IDS, and GAIA, I think this is what people are waiting for, fully integrated system. Thank you very much for this great presentation, Thomas. And the best, and please a full recovery to Liliana, your colleague. Okay, yes, I'll tell her. Thank you. This brings us to the next presentation. Now, what could have a better DNA in data than logistics? So our sister institute in Dortmund, the Fraunhofer ML, we have Dr. Martin Böhmer here, who is going to tell us about the use of IDS architecture for logistics. Martin, the virtual floor is yours now. Thank you very much, Boris, for this introduction. Well, I wouldn't have been able to make a better introduction anyway. Now, also in logistics, the time of platform economies and data economy has started. I mean, we offer real services in logistics based on these platforms. We have transport, warehousing services, but also transport and production services. In line with the European approach, where what we've heard about openness and sovereignty, you can see on this slide here that many, many players come together. And one important question, obviously, for this platform economy is what the infrastructure is like in logistics, which is at the background of this logistics system. And our answer is this, what we have called the silicon economy. We are proud to have been funded by North Rhine-Westphalia, the federal state, and also the federal ministries in order to put together these parts. Because in logistics and in the platform economy, you have IoT devices and cyber-physical systems for real-time data. There will be cloud services for planning and control services. There will be logistics services that will be offered via blockchain brokers and distributed systems. There will be documented and paid for that. Also, smart contact plays a big role. And also at the bottom right, logistics services will also be found via platforms, put together, merged, automatically booked, executed, and automatically billed via blockchain services. This must all be integrated, and we think that against the background of the silicon economy, we believe in open source. So for basic components, we develop these as an open source system and further develop them with the community. We are promoted by public funding, but we also rely very much on participation and involvement from the industry. I have left out a central element, but I'll talk about this now. You have to have a data space for logistics in order to bring the different players and stakeholders together and to guarantee basic principles, openness and central character. Now, on the next page, I would like to talk about how we can come close to that based on use cases and why this is a data space in action. As the use case here, this is a C-parts management, and we are very happy to have a very strong community of partners in the background, and you see the logos of the businesses there at the bottom. C-parts are very important. They are handled by many different players, from the producer all the way to the assembly department in a factory. And we have the whole width of producers, logistics, service providers, and also associations. And also with Commerzbank, we've got a bank looking after the finance in this use case. Currently, data is already exchanged, and this is based on existing business relationships that these companies already have. The predecessor, however, the chain only shares the data with the next in the chain, which means that we have relatively many puddles is a nice term, and based on the use cases of international data spaces, we want to create more connectivity and visibility across the full supply chain for C-parts. And based on that, we will then offer services for transparency, dashboard, but also planning and optimization. This is the approach of our group, and we're happy that we can directly apply this. Fraunhofer's contribution is to make the basic components for open sources, and the community will then specifically make the developments in their companies and share this with other companies. On my final slide, I would like to invite you, I've talked about open source. It refers to software and hardware. I would like to invite you to become involved. This afternoon, in the final breakout session, we can come back to this topic and look at this use case and other logistics use case of a logistics data space, and we will talk about this in more detail. So join us in the breakout session later in the afternoon. Thank you. Okay, great, Martin. So you have really caught up time, very quick as logistics usually are, and you've also referred to the breakout sessions and invited participants to join. I think it is something that we should also keep at the back of our minds, open source. We are all interested in the fact that on the one hand, the infrastructure components can be distributed very widely, and at the same time, it must be a trusted environment. But, well, thank you very much again, Martin, and thank you very much for being available to us in the breakout sessions later.
Now we are moving on to the next data space in action, and we've often heard that we are dealing with an integral, well, I wouldn't like to say central component, because this would sound as if it were a sort of central data base, but a sort of integral component of the IDS architecture, which is also being used in the finance industry. And I would like to welcome Mr. Pettenpohl from our institute, the ISST, and Mr. Jung from the Fraunhofer Institute for Experimental Software, and both of them are the experts for the connector, and the floor is yours now. Yes, fine. I will start. The connector, or differently, the reference architecture for a data space mainly consists of the different components which are defined. That is, apart from the connector, there is a broker, and we will now place the focus on the connector because this is, so to speak, the gateway to exchange data between different companies and within the ecosystem. There are several connectors, and now the first chart, please. There are a total of 8 implementations of connectors because each reference architecture is only a general description of the connectors, but the implementation is not very detailed, and for this reason it is wished that we have different connectors from different companies which will meet different requirements. And at the Fraunhofer, for instance, we have the data space connector which is made available, and we will be seeing that within the breakout session today. Then we've got the trusted connector with special, say, security features, which will also be made available by open source, and the enterprise integration from Fraunhofer AIS, which is mainly about metadata and the integration in the company. But apart from these Fraunhofer developments of connectors, there are also some commercial connectors. This is on the one hand the DIH connector from T-Systems, the GAC connector from German Edge Cloud, and the Orbiter connector from Orbiter. And all these connectors have in common that they are responsible for building up the data space. That is, the use cases which were discussed before can be covered with this. That is, the use cases from logistics or the industry in general can be implemented here, and in order to enable this decentralized exchange. But another role of this is to implement the data use regulations and to enforce the policy so that with respect to this data, we can really ensure what is going to happen to the data. And I will now hand over to Christian. Thank you, Heinrich. Good morning to everybody. And now the next chart, please. What we're seeing here is the implementation of the data use control within IDS. On the one hand, we can see the data provider, and on the other hand, the data consumer. And both of these will be using an IDS connector. And within this IDS connector, we have the core container, we have the use control. There are 2 patterns with respect to the data provider. Is the routing pattern with respect to the data consumer, the interceptor pattern which is used. And what does this mean to us? Well, on this basis, in each data flow, information flow, we can interfere and implement the usage control. It doesn't matter whether it is a data sent or an app or whatever, we can always interfere and we can enforce the data use, the data control rather. And what I've also brought today is an example from the finance sector. The Payment Service Directive was introduced, and this creates the basis for data economy, which means that the data must now make available interfaces, the so-called fintech, as indicated on the right-hand side, so that other data banks can use the data and offer services. But this is only a 0-1 decision now. You as a bank customer can say, I want to use this service or not, which means that first of all you are losing your data sovereignty. What we have done with the IDS connector and control technologies is that we said that we will return the data sovereignty, and I will illustrate this in the following video. Here in this picture we can see Mrs. Sabrina Brown as a bank customer, and on the right-hand side several data consumers. And now we will first register Sabrina Brown, and we can then see, as a customer in banking, several transactions such as the radio license fees, TV fees, and so on. And if Sabrina Brown says, well, I would like to make use of some services such as the credit check or contract optimization, and this use the data. Now I will illustrate it with the credit check, and then the credit check will also show all the transaction data of Sabrina Brown. So I will again log off, and I will show it for the contract contract optimization. And it will also see all the data such as the TV license fees, all the purchases, the place of purchase. And now we want to return data sovereignty to Sabrina Brown, to saying, okay, there are some privacy settings which we can choose. We can say, if the credit check uses this, then only mask data is to be seen, mask transactions, and the contract optimization may be only for, let's say, insurance or energy utilities, and we can say we will save these settings and we will log off again. And we now say, okay, the credit check will use this. What we're seeing now is that some transactions have been masked. For the credit check, the incoming payments must be seen or outgoing payments, but I do not have to see the purpose. And it's similar for the contract optimization. Now we can see only contracts which are related to the energy provider, such as E.ON, Vattenfall, and there are only 11 entries now. Before, there were many more. And so it's quite easy with these technologies and the IDS connector to adapt the existing infrastructure in order to enforce data sovereignty requirements. Yeah, this is very nice, Heinrich and Christian. These are very impressive examples. And Christian, you said that this 0 or 1 decision can be made more flexible. On the other hand, as we have to say, eventually the PTS2 and also the General Data Protection Regulation are sources of the policy, because this is also based on the European values, which are often quoted. So a big thank you to the two of you, and this brings me to the next item of the agenda, because we've seen, as Heinrich said, that on the one hand, the Fraunhofer Institute has several variants of connectors on offer, but this is also being used by several companies, IDE, EGS Association, as Mr. Müller initially said. For instance, the force, the power of many is a big advantage, but if all these things can be used by everybody, by anybody, we must also make sure that we can still guarantee trust, because this is important for the initiative. That is, if some people say that they've got an IDS connector, we must be able to check whether this is true. So eventually we must be able to distinguish between good and bad, or between compliance and non-compliance, and this brings me to certification and standardization, which we are promoting within the context of IDS. And so we are very pleased to have gained you, Monica. You will talk about this, and well, you are very close to the source of the knowledge about this. That is, you can't get any closer because you are developing all this and you work in the field of certification. And so I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Boris. Well, I would like to just talk about what IDS certification is today, how it works, and what the added value is, even though Boris has already mentioned this in his introduction before. I would like to talk about my first page here. I think what you've heard, most of you have heard, is that IDS certification is the main prerequisite for participating in the IDS. You can develop your connectors, you can become active in the community, but if you really want to join the IDS, you require a certification. This, of course, is so for a very good reason, and I would like to explain to you what the reasons are. Now, before I do this, this is a little summary for you. We've got two different types of certification. On the one hand is the certification of components, which you may have been in contact with, which is certifying the components for the requirements that we have. That is interoperability, so that the different components can interact, they understand each other, if you like, and there are many security requirements as well. And we have developed a catalog of criteria which we haven't just, thought out and invented, but we use industry standards such as ISC 6244342, and we've used and implemented best practices from software development, integrated them into our catalog of requirements, and supplemented this by the IDS-specific criteria, which you really need in IDS so the different components can interact. And we want to really make this into a standard and distribute it. On the one hand, we've done this in Germany based on DIN spec 27070, but we also would like to make this more international in order to guarantee comparability and interoperability in the international arena. And as I've said before, we've got certification on components as the one type, but the second type is certification for companies who operate this. I mean, the most secure software architecture doesn't help you if the company behind it isn't managing their systems well, the systems that they operate, or access rights to users and so on. And this is why we have certification for companies. Once again relies on standards that exist, ISO 27001 and the BSI C5 catalog, in order to make sure that companies who operate the IDS system comply with our requirements and conditions. Now, the next slide shows you how the IDS certification process works. Essentially, you have three players. On the one hand, the applicant, that is the company which would like to be certified or which would like to have components certified. You have independent evaluation facilities and a IDS certification body. Now, the company who would like to be certified or have components certified, you have to take two different steps. On the other hand, you must be in contact with the IDS certification body, and you've got the email contact here on the slide, and then you will receive information about the process, and you will also get a list of evaluation facilities. One of the evaluation facilities should then be commissioned by you, and it is the job of this facility to do the testing for you. There are different security levels and evaluation levels, and the IDS certification body will explain the details to you. We don't have enough time to do this here today. But we've got different levels for different use cases as well. And the IDS certification body then monitors all the evaluation facilities and makes the levels comparable in order to ensure that everything is compatible. And on my final slide, I wanted to just show you the summary of what the added value of IDS certification actually is. The different evaluation levels offers you transparent information of what requirements are met by a certain company. And the big benefit of the certification is that you do not have to rely on the company itself acting in a proper way, but you've got an independent third party which has evaluated and tested this for you. And this makes sure that the sovereign decision can be taken by you, whether you would like to share the data and exchange the data or not. And this is the basis of data sovereignty that we would like to have in IDS. Thank you very much for listening. Oh, thank you, Monica. And then I do not only want to thank you, Monica, again, but all the contributors to data spaces in action. We have seen that IDS is already in action. It is used in many industries. And I would like to ask everybody that if you're interested in building these data spaces, and in the welcome talk this morning, we've heard a lot about this, to really become involved and join us. We are prepared, we're ready to cooperate with you, and I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Nowak.
Thank you. A big thank you to you and the experts for these explanations. And I would like to ask the experts to stay with us to answer some questions from the audience. I've seen that you have made good use of the chat function of the Q&A section. And there is one question which I might be able to answer right away, because it's a question for the organizers. That is whether the presentations, the charts, the slides will be made available in the download. Yes, and I can answer this in the affirmative. Within 24 hours, we will try to make available all the written information to you via our platform. Another question is, or maybe for you, Mr. Otto, and it's about further ministries. I mean, we've got the backing from the Ministry for Education and for the Economy, as we've heard. But this very justified question is, what about the Food and Agriculture Ministry or the Health Ministry? How can we convince them of the usefulness of IDS, and how can we develop, prevent double work? Perhaps you have an answer to this, Mr. Otto. Yeah, it's a good question. We initially heard that the role of the government and thus of the ministry is a very important one, because on the one hand, in many data spaces and data ecosystems, we have here the egg and hen question. So we need an outside impetus to develop all this. I mean, it always applies to infrastructure. And furthermore, and this brings me to the answer to this question, is that the different ministries, as was implied by Mr. Schieferdecker, are now also participating in the German data strategy. That is, they are now agreeing on the next few steps, and we can also see that the individual departments and ministries have a major interest in taking this up. That is, IDS in connection with GAIA above all, and this is already happening, as Mr. Böhmer said, in logistics and in the mobility data space. The German Ministry for Transport and Infrastructure is one of the leading players. And for a while now, there have also been some discussions with the German Health Ministry. And this is a very good opportunity for our country. That is, on the basis of the federal specialized ministries, we can continue to spread the good tidings and demonstrate that we are not only talking about all this, but that we are doing something. Thank you, Mr. Otto. We may be able to answer another question. I think it's for you, Mr. Böhmer. It's about brokers. Could you tell us more about the brokers? How do you specify these? Yes, in a nutshell. Oh, well, it would be difficult to do this quickly and briefly. I would like to refer you to the afternoon session. As far as data is concerned, we also comply with the reference architecture model of the International Data Space Association. As far as the logistic services is concerned, that is services, this is indeed one of the challenges at which we are working with our research department, that is with respect to the basic functions. So once more, a big thank you to all the experts, and you are now dismissed gratefully, and your questions will not be lost. The remaining questions will be answered subsequently, and the answers will be made available on this platform. But some answers may already have been anticipated. Let's check this. In a video glossary, our experts will explain in German and English German terms from the world of data ecosystems. And let's have a look at the video where Klaus Nagel, the Managing Director of the International Data Space Association, will explain what GAIA-X and IDS are about. Data spaces as basic paradigms go far beyond data space systems, and they're important enablers of current and future value chains. The IDS standard is an indispensable element for a trusted infrastructure for the joint use of data in Europe and all over the world. It enables the creation of all sorts of data spaces, such as data exchange ecosystems and data marketplaces. The standard guarantees data protection for all parties involved, and it builds up trust between them, and by means of a jointly developed and accepted design, it ensures a fair competition, and it also guarantees data sovereignty for all data providers. As an open standard, IDS will be an integral component of the GAIA-X architecture, and as far as the design features and the safety structure, interoperability and semantics of the data exchange and usage control. The IDA from the very first day has been fully involved in the GAIA-X initiative, and it is now a founding member of the GAIA-X ISBL, and with 5 years work about data spaces, it will accelerate the work of GAIA-X. Ladies and gentlemen, there will be a short break now of 5 minutes, and this should allow you to get a cup of coffee, for instance. And in the meantime, we will be showing the videos. You have seen one of those, and different technical terms will be explained, and you will also find the glossary terms on the platform under the heading Video Glossary on Data Ecosystems. You will find these in the German and English languages. You can check them. As I said, we will have a 5-minute break now, and we will then meet again. Connectors allow it to use apps for data processing. These apps are software packages in a data format, and the possibilities of apps are numerous. You may use them to access backup systems, to transfer data into different formats, and also for complex calculations, such as for image processing and recognition on the basis of deep learning. And there is also an app store for this, which allows the different suppliers to use this safe platform to make available their apps, and other suppliers of connectors may search this app store, and by means of descriptions of data, metadata, they can find the apps which they need for their purposes. And the App Store also makes it possible to carry out the installation on the connector and to use it.
Data broker is a central infrastructure component connecting data providers with data consumers in a data space. It supports with seamless publishing and search for data resources based on their machine-readable metadata. As such, it provides register and indexing capabilities to the IDS, while the data owner of these resources always stays in complete control over their data at all times. The IDS metadata broker communicates using standardized IDS protocols and can instantiate every domain-specific vocabulary, and therefore works independent of every other component or participant. Except, of course, the IDS metadata broker uses the IDS identity checks and verifications delivered by the IDS identity provider. Therefore, the IDS metadata broker is a central component to find and be found in the international data spaces.
Identity Management ist vermeintlich ganz einfach erklärt. Es umfasst alle Prozesse und Infrastrukturkomponenten, die zur Verwaltung digitaler Identitäten notwendig sind. Eine digitale Identität repräsentiert dabei eine Person oder eine Maschine oder einen abstrakten Dienst in der digitalen Welt, zusammen mit allen benötigten Eigenschaften. Vielleicht kann man als Beispiel den neuen Personalausweis nehmen. Eine ausgebende Stelle beglaubigt mir Eigenschaften wie mein Geburtsdatum. Nur ist dieser Ausweis nur digital vorhanden, und so gibt es nicht nur eine ausgebende Stelle, sondern viele, die sich untereinander nicht vertrauen. Digitale Ökosysteme schaffen Vertrauen zwischen den Teilnehmern. Identity Management ist die Grundlage dafür.
To make sure that the actors in a data ecosystem understand each other, and that intelligent apps and services understand the data and can process them automatically, they all have to speak a common language. In the IDS, the common language is the information model for the description of digital resources, for the self-description of infrastructure components, and for the headers of the messages that actors and components exchange. Meanwhile, the IDS information model is a fairly mature and stable ontology based on web standards with Java tool support. Under the hood, the IDS information model is always present. In several domain-specific applications, including mobility, agriculture, and finance, it also explicitly supports interoperability. Based on these foundations, work on an even more comprehensive information model is in progress for the self-descriptions in GAIA-X.
The goal of data ecosystems is to enable new business models that individual actors cannot make possible themselves because they lack of the entirety of data. Let's look at an example for mobility. I, as a traveler, would like to have a service that covers the entire mobility chain from a start to a destination. The mobility service should provide me with ideal support and coordinate the various modes of transport and mobility providers. To make these innovative services possible, we need a data ecosystem. No single actor has all the data it needs to offer this innovative service itself. Technically, a data ecosystem can be implemented with the help of data spaces. There, a data provider can share his data with the data ecosystem and at the same time keep control and overview of his own data with the help of data sovereignty.
Ich hoffe, Sie sind alle wohlbehalten aus der kurzen Pause zurückgekommen und konnten sich stärken und sind ähnlich gespannt wie ich, wie es nun weitergeht. Ich freue mich nun, Ihnen Frau Antje Williams von der
I'm very pleased to welcome Antje Williams from Deutsche Telekom. Ms. Williams, we're very interested in hearing not only about the view of a potential user, but also a potential operator of data ecosystems. You've got the floor, please. Thank you very much for inviting me and for having this opportunity to talk about this from the perspective of Deutsche Telekom. I think you have just heard the interesting discussion and also the video by Lars Nagel, the CEO of IDSA. I mean, the topics are similar, but maybe the viewpoint is a little different. Deutsche Telekom is a member of IDSA. I'm also a member of the board of the IDSA personally, and we're also one of the drivers of GAIA-X. This is why these are the two topics I would like to talk about, maybe from a different angle. Now, when you look at the overall situation here, first of all, we're talking about data. Data today is called the new petrol of societies, and nobody can deny that it is so very important, data and data usage. There are many challenges that we must be aware of, in particular when it comes to industrial data and generating a use out of this data. Sometimes it then becomes more difficult. Sometimes we lack standards for certain processes. And it is a challenge to sort the data, that is, sorting it in such a way that it can be used with a benefit, it can be evaluated. And in order to do that, I need good data material. In addition, you must also be aware of the fact that people in the industry have many reservations about sharing data. Sometimes it seems like private data, personal data, is shared with much fewer reservations than industry data. But this problem must be overcome. If we don't overcome the problem, these obstacles, we won't be able to really benefit from the data use. And this is the basic idea between GAIA-X. In GAIA-X, which is based on a very political debate, the question is, what can we do in order to create a sovereign data ecosystem? How can we develop this? How can we achieve this? And even though it is initially a European project, a European initiative, and in the beginning it was driven very much by Germany and France, and is now being enlarged to the whole of Europe. But nevertheless, it's not only about involving European players, but it is about us as Europeans saying and defining what we would like to do with data, what ecosystem we would like to have, a trusted ecosystem. And what should this ecosystem look like? It's not about excluding anybody, but it's about developing a standard where at some point you give the European industry the possibility of using data in a trusted environment. Let me compare it. I mean, what does GAIA-X stand for? It's really about three main components. You can maybe compare it with an engine. I mean, for a car, you need an engine, you need petrol, and you need the customer being willing to pay for the petrol and for the engine. And the three components are also here in GAIA-X. The engine is an open software that I can use as a customer, which creates transparency and meets very high security standards. This is the engine, if you like, the metaphor. And I would like to come back to this later because the IDSA has already made a wonderful contribution to this that offers itself as a basis. The second element is the ecosystem. In the beginning, it's a huge challenge to get this, and this is where we are. At the moment, also based on GAIA-X, we've got a very high awareness for how to handle data, for data sovereignty, and how all of this can be done for our companies and businesses. We've already done this and looked at this question, but we now must take action. We need companies building, developing these systems. Deutsche Telekom is one of them, but there are many other players, of course. We need customers who are willing to test and accept the system. We believe that it is a very valuable first step to get such an ecosystem started to, for example, have the public demand for such data management is very clearly defined. And then we ask for this ecosystem to be developed. And once you have the start of the ecosystem, you must fill it with load, having a critical mass to fill it up in terms of customers. So it's not static, but it's dynamic and can be further developed in innovative solutions where many, many customers come together and then actually create an added value from the data that will be processed in a trusted and secure environment. This is the basic idea between GAIA-X. We want to have a not-for-profit company that is to be founded in Europe in order to use this as a kick-off element, a vehicle for GAIA-X. We believe it's a very valuable initiative that is worth becoming involved in. Let me show you what we've already got. We've got the IDSA with more than 100 businesses coming together. in order to create the basis, create the engine, if you like, that I've just mentioned. So we have been able to sort of all found a legal network where over 100 businesses are represented, smaller ones, bigger ones, who jointly have worked on this standard and have been able to develop an architecture which is the foundation of the requirements of industry for sovereign data use. And I think this is a big step, an important step into the further development of an ecosystem, which doesn't exist today. We have many ideas, many use cases. Many of my colleagues have already mentioned this. I think we're on the right track here. And I can only ask all of you, when you listen, please become involved, support us. I think it's very important for German industry, for digitalization of our industry, and for our European partners at the same time. I would like to thank you for listening. I wish you a very enjoyable and interesting day, and I'm looking forward to more interesting presentations. Thank you very much, Ms. Williams, for your presentation and for your comparison with the car you made. I mean, we in Germany like cars so much, so that makes it ever more easy to understand it.
Kennengelernt und wir haben auch die Betreiberseite kennengelernt. Jetzt gilt es, das Ganze mal auf den Prüfstand zu stellen. Und mit Broaden the Horizon wollen wir jetzt Entschuldigung, ein wenig über den Tellerrand hinausblicken, unseren Horizont erweitern. Ich muss dazu sagen, der folgende Programmpunkt, der wird nun in Englisch
Broaden the Horizon, and the next item will be in English. And if you want to listen to the original version, I would like to ask you to now switch over to the English version, because on the German channel there will be the German simultaneous translation. And now I would like to welcome Mr. Lars Nagel, whom we met with respect to the first video glossary term about GAIA-X. Thank you. And now you will facilitate the next discussion, and would you be so kind as to introduce your guests to us?
Yes, I'm more than happy to do so. It was an amazing event so far, a lot of input and insights. Dear audience, dear followers in the digital world, dear friends of IDSA, dear colleagues, I'm really happy to say a warm hello to all of you. And I do have the honor to moderate this session and present to you a really versatile constellation of speakers. We do have Claudia Eckert from Fraunhofer-Gesellschaft bringing security and trust in data sharing. We have Susanne Dehme representing Bitkom and therefore a huge part of the IT sector. Henk-Jan Fink from TNO bringing in the very market-oriented view of data sharing from the Netherlands. And Marco Turpeinen from 1001 Lakes from Finland, harmonizing data spaces already for a long time. Let me shortly, introduce and motivate this session. We learned from the previous speakers that we are in a comfortable starting position in terms of making the data economy finally happen. So we may not have data lakes, but at least puddles or even ponds, as we learned, and I really like the term. So our goal in today's sequence of panels and presentations is to reflect and sketch what different stakeholders can contribute to make the common data spaces, which were mentioned, really happen. I learned recently the term of embryonic data spaces. I like this term really a lot, as it states that there's already life and energy which will grow on its own. It will be our role to give birth to these embryonic data spaces and nurture and support them. So I see the faces of my panelists, my dear colleagues. So it's great to see you. Thanks a lot for joining us, being part of the panel. And I would like to leave the floor to you and spend and give time for your statements. Let me start with the first question to Claudia Eckert. We heard a lot about data sovereignty and trust and data sharing, and a representative from your institute explained us a lot on certification already. So perhaps you can give a deep dive. What is really feasible concerning trust and security from a technical perspective? I think we all would like to learn more on this because, well, we're talking a lot about data, but this is what we really can get a grip on. Claudia, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Lars. Hello, everybody, dear colleagues. Well, what is really feasible? Let's broaden a bit the view. I think we are familiar with protecting data at rest, but fulfilling the requirement of these core value proposition of our data spaces we have. It's not only encrypting data at rest. So we need other technologies. So we need to move data. Okay, we all know technology for protecting data at move. We encrypt them. Okay, we use these things, but it's not enough. What we want to have is some sort of technology that enables us to control the use of data wherever it is, and to be ensured that the processing of the data is done in a confidential and controllable manner wherever it is. And this kind of technology is more than just encrypting data during transfer, like TLS protocols we have. It's more than just store it in an encrypted manner. We have to provide some sort of trustworthy execution environments, starting in the sensors, putting these environments into edge devices, gateways, and putting in well, cloud platforms like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure. We have this technology at hand, combined with some sort of confidential computing, benefiting from features modern CPUs already offer. So we can build these trustworthy execution environment. That's not only necessary for data, it's also necessary for code. Code is data as well. So you ship code to the data. If data that is not allowed to leave the local environment, you have to protect code as well. And it's not only about protecting it in use. You have to define rules, what is allowed to use, who is allowed to benefit from these data. And that is all about usage control. So the first thing is done by connectors, trusted connector technology and concept we already have developed, which are in place in very different technologies already. The second pillar is usage control. We had heard a lot of it, but what is this in practice? In practice, it's you can define rules when data code must be deleted, who is able to use it, under which conditions. And the main thing is to enforce these rules. Just specifying something is easy, but enforcing it wherever these data is being used, is processed, that is the most important thing. And that is, again, if you have this kind of trusted execution environment, which are trustworthy in the sense you can attest whatever is going on there, then you have a trust building block at hand that everything goes right. And that is something the IDS is offering. These are reference implementations we already have. And so we can put real technology at work for doing that, delivering data sovereignty, control over data throughout the whole life cycle, during pre-processing, transfer, storage, and use.
Thank you so much for this deep dive, and I think well, we should all learn a little bit more, because data is really a valuable asset, and we have to know the measures how we can maneuver with data. And so I think that is absolutely important insights which you shared. Thanks a lot. Well, I would like to hand over to Susanne Demel from Bitkom. I think your role is, well, to be the voice from industry, especially from the IT sector. So it's especially the IT sector which will have to build all of these things which, and all the groundwork we do have at hand into services, offerings and products to stimulate markets. So we have been building GAIA since 1.5 years, and I'm really happy to see your face again. A warm welcome again. So the question, so what is the most benefit in data sharing, and how can we motivate them to finally make these data spaces really happen and to start the data economy?
Thank you, Lars, for the friendly welcome. I think there are huge chances in data sharing, and why is that so? I think we actually, you talked about the information technology sector, but as you know, Bitkom calls itself a digital economy association, because I think there won't be an ICT sector anymore, but all companies will be digital companies, and this is a chance for, especially for the European company, and we have, as we have so many players in the B2B sector in different sectors like mobility, like health and pharmaceutical industry, like in of course in manufacturing. Where we really have a deep knowledge in these sectors, in production. And so far we have business models that are based on products, but we are in the process of transforming these business models into more service-based, platform-based business models. And this gives us a whole range of new opportunities. This means if we have interoperable standards and secure gateways, as was just described, we can share.
Okay. I think we have a challenge with the internet connection. That's really a pity. And yeah, let's have 20 seconds more and then wait for another opportunity. Yeah, okay. So we would really have loved to hear the statements, but then I would like to use the opportunity to hand over to Henk Jan. Well, the title of our session is Broaden the Horizon. So in the Netherlands, well, I feel you always have obviously slightly better binoculars than the rest of the world. And well, what do you see for the next phase of data spaces evolution? Please share it with us.
Okay, thanks, Lars. In the first place for having me here. I don't know if we have better binoculars, but we are a small country, so we need to cooperate. Government, private sector, and knowledge institutes. We are very closely aligned. So therefore, it might seem that we have better binoculars, but I'm not sure that's really true. What I see as the next phase for data sharing is we come a long way, actually. Yeah? We have seen that, for instance, proprietary solutions from companies for data sharing were in place. Then we saw a little shift towards sector, and these sectors created their own solutions. And now we see that we need generic standards, because I see the development from value chains more into value networks, whereas you can see that the data you can combine, for example, to do artificial intelligence and learning from data sets from different sectors to create solutions for societal problems, but also to optimize business models, you need data from more than one data space actually. So I believe that we need already to keep the next step inside, where we move from value chains towards value networks. And therefore, for me, standardization, as we do in IDSA, but which is also inside with GAIA-X, is very important. We need to have the fundament in place, and then we can really create value in these new value networks.
So, thanks a lot. It helps us, and perhaps Fraunhofer can help us improving our binoculars. Let's see what we can learn jointly. IDSA is probably a very good rearm for doing so. I'm really happy that I see Susanne moving again. So I think you are able to, well, complete your statement. So I would hand over to you.
Okay, thank you. Very sorry for that. Of course, that happened to the representative of the Digital Association, but never mind. I'm not sure what was the last words you could hear from me, but I just go on by saying I think we can benefit a great deal of the opportunity to use and exchange data between different sectors, like the energy sector and the mobility sector, for example, with electric cars and a new infrastructure for loading them. For example, there's a whole new range of business opportunities for the energy sector. At the same time, public sector and OEMs, car manufacturers, can work together to improve the infrastructure. The whole logistics can be improved. All these data exchanges can also help to solve the big problems that we are facing, the reduction of the carbon footprint, climate change, etc. So I think the use is clear. The only challenge is how do we actually use the technical opportunities that are currently created, and how do we get also the legal framework right that we will need to do all this to make that happen. So I'm not sure how much. I think I probably have consumed most of my time, so maybe we can go on in the discussion. Absolutely fine. Thanks a lot. And I think it's a perfect handover to Marco. We heard in the initial statements a lot about the European data strategy. We heard a lot about infrastructure for data, which has to be erected, and a lot about policies and rules. I personally feel that a lot of people cannot really figure out what really has to be done on this regard, and what all these terms really mean. So perhaps you can help us complementing a little bit these pictures and tell us also from a regulatory perspective, but also on the perspective of personal data, from a legal perspective, what can be done. We have several joint efforts with Zitra on rule books. Please let us know about this, and perhaps, what could really help in the next month. Marco, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Lars, and really my great pleasure to be here. To continue with the water metaphor, so yes, we need to have the technology that allows us to combine the data from the puddles and streams into lakes and oceans, vast repositories of data. But then if you think of what the ecosystem really means, it's not only about the data, it's about the actors that are part of the ecosystem. And how do we come to a situation where these ecosystems actually have shared rules which allow this interoperability for real, not only from the technical point of view, but also from the point of view of business models, from the point of view of the legal questions, from the ethical point of view. So I think that's the crucial thing that we need to figure out. And one of the let's say attempt, a reasonably good attempt that we've done in Finland is that Sitra that you mentioned, which is the Finnish Innovation Fund, has a larger initiative that's called the Fair Economy Program, IHAN, and Fair Data Economy Program. And inside that, one of the outputs of the Fair Data Economy Program is actually a rulebook model, where it's a template, open template, anybody can use it. But the idea is that if you have a data network, if you have a group of parties that need to come into agreement on not only the technical principles, but also the principles of what are our rules of the game in the value exchange that's related to the data, how do we actually agree on the legal side? So we've come with, well, you should go through these questions. These are the legal templates that you could use in your multi-party data sharing. And I think this can be a helpful starting point so that we have something that people can take, use examples from other communities. So that's one way to get things going. Then in terms of, well, how do you make this scale and what makes this then into a really feasible opportunity for Europe, for example, to challenge kind of the current status quo. So I think the story goes very much from this idea of, well, we need to move them from these individual networks into networks of networks, into ecosystems that are composed of ecosystems. And that is the way then how you bootstrap into a real data economy. And again, kind of the fairness, it's important. So fair related to data, there is this notion of FAIR, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But my opinion is that you need more. And you need to have those usage rules. You need to have those kind of ways to control the use to make it fair. And not only fair for organizations, also fair for individuals, fair for the society, for the public good. That's another balance that we need to strike.
Yeah, well, thank you for this great input. So what has to be done? What is really the next step in the next 6 months for us to go jointly? One endeavor which we are driving together is we are working in this task force on European level on design principles for data spaces. And I like this endeavor a lot because we bring together the rather technical point of view, which we do have from this whole IDSA ecosystem, together with the more global view, more personal data view, which you were mentioning. So I'm happy that you are on board. Other initiatives, My Data, and so on. So I feel we have to really bring those together, come up with, rule books and very concrete reusable building blocks, not only technology, but also contracts, legal agreements, and so on. So perhaps, as we have only 3 minutes to go, perhaps a really short last statement from each of you. So considering the next 6 months, what would help all of us making ponds towards streams and lakes, on a European perspective, what could help us? Where can also perhaps politics stimulate this? Henk-Jan, your 2 sentences.
Okay, now for me, it's of course it's very important to share. This week we put a lot of software on GitHub. For instance, where we actually worked on images of lung pictures and the treatments related to COVID. And we created software models, semantic models, but we also found a way to, through federated learning, to get access to a lot of data from a lot of different countries, from a lot of different continents. and we put it on, we did it the IDS way, we did it Go Fair way, we use these standards, and we publish them on GitHub. So if you can share these kind of examples, it can be a starting point for others to pick up and build on them.
Yeah, well, great. And everyone should have a look at this because this is a really impressive endeavor. Claudia, what do you think should be done?
Well, I could emphasize this approach, that is open source, sharing all what we did already in an open community to lower the bars, to use it to explore what is possible. But in addition to that, I think we have to build up trust throughout certification processes. We have to build the certification schemas. We have to build the test environments. We already heard in the speech before this session. So having that in place, these open source gaming reference architectures, the test scenarios and certification will help us a lot.
Okay. Susanne, what do you feel that we should do jointly in the next month?
Well, I totally agree with what was said already, but in addition to that, I think we really have to be able to use the technical framework that we've created. We have to think about how do we do the business operations, and I think what was said about the model contracts, that's a very helpful tool, especially for smaller players to use. We have to need standardized clauses for certain use cases or kinds of cases. So ideally that we can combine these model clauses for many different uses, but create transparency and understanding through that. So I think that will be helpful.
Okay, then thank you. Marco, the last words and seconds for you.
Okay, so, well, basically my wish is that we will have a lot of plenty and plenty of use cases that really show the value of the European approach. And yeah, let's hope that we have more than 1,001 of them.
Yeah, so we are really happy that you chose, obviously, the perfect name for your company. And I think this water idea will lead us for the next time to come. I think we are at the end of our panel discussion. I would really say great, big, large thank you to all of you. I hope that we really make this happen. We have now a list of things to do. Let's really operationalize this. We have several realms to do so. I'm happy. So let's bring it into GAIA-X, but also on the European level. Open the Eye as a European project can help us stimulating a lot. Everyone is welcome to IDSA to have more of these thoughts. Thanks a lot, and I would like to close with a statement from Susanne, which I liked a lot. So all companies are digital companies. So what we are talking about today, it touches everyone, and therefore we should really spread the word and create awareness to make all of this happen. Thanks a lot so much, and hope to see all of you on some other occasion in the next days. Goodbye from my side, and thanks again.
Yeah, the interlocutors for these interesting insights, perspectives, and we are eager to see what the future is holding in store for us. Yes, that's true. Thanks a lot. Now we will move on to another item of the agenda, which will require your active contributions. That is, we are We are now coming to the breakout sessions, and these are taking place in their own rooms, which you can access via our platform. And you can see in your personal agenda what breakout session you're registered for. And I would like to underline that the breakout sessions will be in English, and this time there will be no simultaneous translation, neither into German nor into English. And there will be a break in the live stream for about 30 minutes, and we would like to ask you to come back after 30 minutes so that before the second breakout sessions, you can hear the farewell comments of the organizers, and I hope that you will have many interesting and fruitful discussions.
Willkommen zurück, meine Damen und Herren.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you had very interesting breakout sessions, and I hope that you found this day as interesting as I do. Mr. Otto, Mr. Nagel, what are your conclusions of this day? Perhaps Mr. Nagel first. Well, yes, I'm happy to do so, now in German. Well, as so often in the past few weeks, I'm really very impressed by the energy which is here. In this year, it's really different from the prior years. We have been doing this for many years. That is, we have been working the field of data spaces, what is the potential, and why is it of such essential importance to deal with this subject. And to really gain the insight that this is something new, a new paradigm of value creation in the data ecosystem on the basis of data. And I feel that this has now been fully understood by the industry, by policymakers, and now there is some work being done to translate this into reality. We don't have to convince anybody any longer. We are now entering the next phase of doing, and in the prior sessions I used the term of embryonic data spaces, and we must now nurture the many small platforms and ecosystems, and we must merge them to create something bigger. Not immediately the big European data space, but in the individual domains. We must make the leap from little one-to-one, few-to-few ecosystems to M2N or end-to-end relationships. And yeah, that we must now really start this. And my impression is that this still needs to be managed. We can see it in the field of mobility, that it can work very well. The AK Tech became active, and I think we must see who could assume such a managing role in other domains. This applies to every domain. This applies to the European level, and the Commission is using terms such as the Data Innovation Board and what specifically is supposed to happen there, and what would be the role of IDSA, of Fraunhofer, Ada Tech or Bitkom. And all of us are cooperating within GAIA-X, and I believe that there is a great deal of energy here, and we should now join ranks with those who would be able to do this and to stimulate the ecosystems and cause them to make the next step. Thank you, Mr. Nagel. Mr. Otto, what is your summary? Yes, I can only subscribe to what the speaker before me said, Lars, said. So now many things are coming together, are converging in many industries. There is a great deal of momentum to promote all this, to push it forward. And this will certainly also be expedited by the COVID-19 pandemic, because now we are thinking more about the future of the economy of value creation. And I mean, not only post-pandemic, it's certainly one triggering factor, but we can now jointly think about how this data-based economy is to be shaped, managed in future. And there is an emerging consensus now. That is that on the one hand, we have to get weaving And what is also being understood more and more, that a single group cannot do it on a go-it-alone basis. This is one of the characteristics of databases and the new database services. Nobody has all the data alone which are needed to promote this. You need your own data, you need data from partner networks, you also need context data, which is often provided by the public sector. So we are all sitting in one boat, and this is also the underlying idea of ecosystems, where we want to keep a certain balance and equilibrium, even if everybody pursues their own business model. And as I said before, this is not the simpler version of organized things, that is this very collaborative and sometimes even competitive approach, but this is what we need to do now, and we do have the technology to do it, the equipment, the hardware, and we must now begin to develop these multilateral structures, that is the ecosystems. I'm quite confident, and I've said so often, it's really fun, I enjoy this, and I'm very pleased that so many people joined us here for this virtual conference. Thank you, Mr. Otto. Thank you, Mr. Nagel. All the best to you. And ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to remind you of the second breakout session, which is going to start at 22:01, and I hope we have been able to convince you that secure data spaces, ecosystems are there to be used, and I hope that you could also come up with an appropriate application. I invite you to stay in touch with us, to stay in touch with our experts. The platform which we are based on should be a first step towards this. Now, I would like to wish you a pleasant afternoon, stay in good health, and I hope that you appreciated this conference.